Picture holding a map in your hands that shows dragons swimming in distant oceans, mythical kingdoms nestled beyond impassable mountains, and paradise itself drawn as a real place you could theoretically visit, if only you could sail beyond the edge of the known world. This wasn't fantasy, this was reality on parchment for people living centuries ago. The medieval mapmakers who created these breathtaking documents had never seen the territories they were drawing. They had no satellites, no GPS, no photographs from explorers, just whispers from travelers, fragments of ancient texts, unshakable faith, and the raw power of their own imaginations. They mapped the world not as it was, but as they dreamed, feared, and believed it to be. And in doing so, they didn't just draw coastlines, they drew the very boundaries of human understanding in an age of profound mystery. Think about that for a moment. We live in a time when every inch of the planet is charted, measured, and visible at the tap of a screen. But for medieval cartographers, blank spaces on a map weren't voids to be filled with data. They were canvases for storytelling, theology, and wonder. These were scholars, monks, and artists who blended half-heard rumors of camel caravans on the Silk Road with biblical descriptions of the Garden of Eden. They placed sea monsters where currents were unpredictable and marked the homes of strange races in lands no European had ever visited. Their maps were less about navigation and more about meaning. They were visual representations of how an entire civilization saw itself and its place in a cosmos full of danger, divinity, and mystery. In this video, we're going to step directly into the minds of these visionary creators. We'll explore how faith shaped coastlines, how myths became mountains, and how the scarce, often distorted accounts from travelers were woven into maps that kings and popes used to make world-altering decisions. This is a story about the courage to define the unknown, and the beautiful, sometimes startling, consequences of drawing what you cannot see. It's about the intersection of art and belief, of ignorance and ingenuity, and how these intricate deceptions actually helped guide real explorers toward real discoveries that would change the globe forever. So settle in, we're not just looking at old maps, we're decoding a lost way of seeing the world itself. To understand the world these mapmakers were trying to capture, we first have to step back into the intellectual and physical rubble of the fallen Roman Empire. This wasn't just a political collapse, it was a shattering of the known world. The sophisticated Roman road networks, which had effectively functioned as linear maps connecting a vast empire, were crumbling. Long-distance travel became perilous, and the steady flow of information that had once connected Britain to Egypt dried up almost completely. Into this void of knowledge stepped a new kind of creator, the medieval cartographer. Their task was monumental. With the great libraries of antiquity scattered or burned, they had to reconstruct the entire world from a handful of surviving fragments. And they did so by weaving together three powerful but often conflicting threads: the fading echo of classical science, the overwhelming new lens of Christian faith, and the tantalizing, half-understood whispers from the few travelers who dared to cross horizons. The most iconic and enduring model to emerge from this fusion was the T&O map, or Mapa Mundi. At first glance, it looks nothing like a map to our modern eyes. It presents the world as a perfect circle, a symbol of divine unity and completeness. A T shape inside the O divides the circle into three parts. Asia occupies the top half, with Europe and Africa sharing the bottom. The vertical stem of the T is the Mediterranean Sea, separating Europe from Africa, while the crossbar is formed by the Nile River and the Don River, dividing those continents from Asia. This was geography as theological diagram. Jerusalem always sat at the very center of this world, literally the navel of creation, while east was placed at the top, the direction of the rising sun, and the presumed location of the Garden of Eden. These weren't mistakes or oversights, they were deliberate choices that placed spiritual truth far above terrestrial accuracy. The map was a guide to the soul's journey, not the body's. These early maps were also multimedia experiences, dense with illustrations that served a clear educational purpose. In an era when the vast majority of the population was illiterate, a map was a sermon you could see. You might find Adam and Eve depicted in Eden, Noah's Ark resting on the mountains of Ararat, or the monstrous races said to inhabit the farthest edges of the earth. These features taught biblical stories and reinforced a cosmic order where Christendom was central, safe, and sanctified, while the unknown margins were wild, dangerous, and in need of salvation. They were less about getting you from London to Rome and more about reminding you of the path from sin to redemption. The raw materials for these incredible documents were a patchwork of authority and anecdote. The most important text was the Bible itself, which provided not just spiritual guidance but also specific, if sometimes cryptic, geographical descriptions. Then there were the revered classical authorities, particularly the work of a Roman-Egyptian scholar named Claudius Ptolemy. His text, the Geography, was a revolutionary work that proposed a coordinate system of latitude and longitude and contained instructions for projecting a spherical Earth onto a flat surface. But here's the fascinating catch. For much of the early Middle Ages, Western European scholars had lost the actual maps that accompanied Ptolemy's text. They had only the written descriptions, which they often misinterpreted or tried to reconcile with their own Christian worldview. They were trying to build a satellite with the instruction manual for a sundial. Alongside these august texts, mapmakers clung to every traveler's tale they could find. A merchant's description of a strange coastline, a pilgrim's account of the Holy Land, or a soldier's story about the East. All were grist for the mill, filtered through layers of translation, exaggeration, and the unwavering desire to make the pieces of a broken world fit back together into a picture that made sense, a picture that felt whole, ordered, and holy. So if the T&O map was the basic template, faith was the ink that gave it color, meaning, and life. For the medieval mind, the physical world was not a separate realm from the spiritual one. It was a direct expression of it. Every mountain, river, and continent was thought to be imbued with divine intention, a page in a vast, holy book written by the hand of God. Consequently, the mapmaker's primary role wasn't to measure distances with scientific objectivity, but to illustrate this sacred narrative. Their compass didn't just point north, it pointed toward heaven. This wasn't a matter of ignoring reality, but of interpreting a higher, more significant reality, one where spiritual truth outweighed mere physical fact. This profound influence is most powerfully seen in the unwavering placement of Jerusalem at the exact center of the known world. This wasn't a geographic calculation based on travel times or coordinate measurements. It was a theological imperative drawn directly from biblical scripture like Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 5, which describes the city as set in the midst of the nations. By centering their maps on Jerusalem, cartographers were visually asserting a core Christian belief that the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, which occurred there, was the single most important event in human history, the pivotal moment around which all of time and space revolved. The map was a constant reminder that you, the viewer, wherever you were, existed in relation to this holy epicenter. This devotional cartography extended far beyond a single city. Mapmakers populated the world with scenes from Scripture, turning geography into a stage for salvation history. In the Far East, at the very top of the map, you would almost always find a detailed illustration of the Garden of Eden, often shown as a walled island with the serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge and Adam and Eve hiding in shame. This wasn't considered a mythical or allegorical place. It was charted as a real, physical location that, in theory, a very determined pilgrim could one day reach. Similarly, the mountains of Armenia would be marked not just for their elevation, but as the final resting place of Noah's Ark. The Red Sea might be painted a dramatic red and depicted with walls of water, forever commemorating the miracle of the Exodus. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were fundamental landmarks in a Christian's understanding of the world and their place within God's plan. This approach created a fascinating and sometimes tense relationship with classical knowledge. When the accounts of ancient authorities like Ptolemy or Pliny the Elder conflicted with the Word of God, Scripture always won. A prime example is the concept of the antipodes, the idea that people lived on the opposite side of a spherical Earth. This was a well-known theory from classical times, but many prominent church fathers like Lactantius and Saint Augustine vehemently opposed it. Their reasoning was theological. If the world was a sphere, then people on the bottom would be upside down, and it was impossible that Christ would have died for a race of men who walked with their feet above their heads. Furthermore, since all humans were descended from Adam and had to be reached by the Word of God, a spherical Earth with inaccessible continents would suggest a flaw in divine plan. Therefore, most medieval world maps clearly depict a flat, disc-shaped world surrounded by a single, impassable ocean, not because they were ignorant of other ideas, but because they were faithful to a specific interpretation of their faith. This fusion of piety and practicality meant these maps served a dual purpose. For a monk in a monastery, studying a Mapa Mundi was an act of devotion, a way to contemplate the wonders of creation and the story of redemption. For a king or a bishop, the same map was a tool of power and policy. It visually justified the Crusades, showing the holy city of Jerusalem held by infidels in a world that was rightfully Christ's. It reinforced the Church's authority as the sole source of truth and the only institution that could explain man's place in the universe. In a world rife with disease, war, and uncertainty, these maps provided a profound comfort. They presented a universe that was not random or chaotic, but meticulously ordered and governed by a divine will. Every strange creature in a distant land, every river that flowed to the sea, and every star in the sky was part of a plan, and the map was the key to understanding your role within it. But what do you do when faith provides the borders, yet vast territories within those borders remain utterly blank? You turn to the most powerful human tool for explaining the unknown: storytelling. Faced with immense white spaces on their parchments, medieval mapmakers didn't see emptiness, they saw potential. These voids were invitations, and into them they poured a rich tapestry of myths, legends, and folklore, transforming terra incognita from a simple admission of ignorance into a vibrant landscape of imagination and meaning. The monsters and marvels they drew were far more than quirky decorations. They were sophisticated cartographic tools, a visual language used to categorize, explain, and caution. Consider the enduring legend of Alexander the Great. His historical conquests were already legendary, but by the Middle Ages they had been utterly fused with myth. Mapmakers were particularly fascinated by stories of his journey to the very edges of the earth. A common feature on maps like the Herford Mapa Mundi is the depiction of Alexander shut up behind a great wall of brass or mountains in the distant northeast of Asia. The story went that during his campaigns he had encountered the unclean nations of Gog and Magog, who were prophesied to bring about the apocalypse. To save civilization, he used divine help to build an immense barrier, imprisoning these monstrous hordes until the end of days. For a medieval viewer, seeing this on a map wasn't reading a fairy tale. It was seeing a critical piece of eschatological geography. It marked a real location where a future, terrifying event was destined to occur, blending history, prophecy, and cartography into a single, powerful symbol. It turned a remote, unknown part of Asia into a place of immense theological significance. Then there was the ultimate prize, the earthly paradise. The Garden of Eden was not considered a lost metaphor but a real, physical location that had been removed from human reach after the fall. Based on biblical descriptions placing it in the east, mapmakers consistently situated it at the very top of their maps, the farthest point east one could travel. It was always drawn as an island, often walled or ringed by a river of fire, utterly inaccessible to mortal men. This placement served a profound dual purpose. First, it satisfied the scriptural requirement, giving the faithful a tangible location for their origin story. Second, it created an absolute, uncrossable boundary. Beyond paradise, there was literally nowhere else to go. It was the ultimate cartographic full stop, a geographical answer to a theological limit. It told every person looking at the map that the world had an edge, and that edge was defined by God. But the maps weren't just concerned with the edges of the world. They were also filled with its inhabitants. The Bechery's popular illustrated volumes describing animals both real and imaginary were a primary source for the creatures that swam in the oceans and walked in distant lands. The cynosphali, or dog-headed men, were a standard feature often placed in Asia. The Blemii, a race of headless men with faces on their chests, were said to inhabit Africa. And the Cyapods, or shadow feet, were bizarre beings with a single, giant foot they used to hop at great speed, and whose enormous soul they would raise like an umbrella to shade themselves from the sun. To our modern eyes, these seem like absurd fantasies, but for the medieval cartographer, they served a crucial scientific and social function. In the absence of real ethnographic data, these creatures became a way to categorize human difference. They represented the idea that the further one traveled from the center of Christendom in Jerusalem, the more distorted and monstrous God's creation became. They were a warning about the perils of the unknown and a reinforcement of the viewer's own normalcy and centrality in God's plan. The most famous of these embellishments are, of course, the sea monsters. Lurking in the oceans on maps like the Carta Marina are fantastical beasts with coiled tails, fearsome teeth, and serpentine necks. These were not random acts of artistic whimsy. Each one was often drawn from a specific, described creature in a text like the Physiologus or the Travels of Sir John Manville. They were placed in specific sea lanes and near certain coasts, often corresponding with areas known for treacherous sailing conditions, unpredictable weather, or simply a lack of reliable charts. A dragon spouting fire near a rocky coastline was a far more effective and memorable warning to illiterate sailors than a simple notation of dangerous rocks. It was a form of early data visualization, using a shared cultural vocabulary of fear and wonder to communicate critical information. The monster was the symbol for the very real and terrifying experience of a sudden squall, a hidden reef, or a ship being lost without a trace. This practice reveals a fundamental truth about how these mapmakers saw their role. They were not just geographers, they were synthesists and storytellers. Their goal was to create a comprehensive image of the world, one that included everything that was known and believed, whether it could be verified by the eye or only by the soul. A map that only showed the confirmed coastlines would have been seen as incomplete, a book with most of its pages missing. By filling the blanks with the stories of Alexander, the location of paradise, and the races of monstrous men, they were creating a complete, coherent, and divinely ordered cosmos on a single sheet of vellum. They were mapping not just land, but belief itself, demonstrating that sometimes the story of a place is just as important as its coordinates. Yet with scripture providing the borders and myths coloring in the continents, the medieval mapmaker still faced a critical problem, a desperate lack of first-hand observation. This is where the traveler stepped onto the stage, becoming an unwitting and often unreliable co-author of the world map. Merchants, pilgrims, and the rare, intrepid explorer returned from beyond the horizon with stories that were devoured by scholars and cartographers alike. These accounts were the breaking news of their day, the tantalizing data points from the front lines of the unknown. But like a game of telephone played across continents and languages, these tales were almost always distorted, embellished, and filtered through a thick lens of cultural expectation and personal agenda. The mapmaker's challenge was to take these fractured, fantastical whispers and assemble them into a coherent picture, a task that required equal parts critical thinking and creative license. Consider the most famous example, Marco Polo. His travelogue, dictated while he was a prisoner of war, was a sensation across Europe. He described the incredible wealth of Kublai Khan's court, the wonders of Chinese engineering, and the strange customs of the East. But woven into these largely accurate descriptions were accounts that stretched credulity. He spoke of the island of Java having unicorns, which modern historians believe were misinterpretations of rhinoceroses. He described the province of Fansa, where men grew tails and lived in the trees. He told of the barren island of Angamanain, populated by what he called dog-headed cannibals. For a cartographer in Genoa or Venice, who had never seen anything more exotic than a trading galley, how were they to separate the rhinoceros from the unicorn? Lacking any other frame of reference, the safest bet was to include it all. So onto the maps went the unicorns and the cynosfolly, not as fables, but as reported fauna, catalogued right alongside the elephants and camels. The traveler's word, however strange, carried the weight of empirical evidence. Even more impactful than descriptions of strange beasts were the political and religious rumors that shaped geopolitics for centuries. The most potent of these was the enduring legend of Prester John. This story began circulating in the 12th century, telling of a powerful Christian king, a priest king, or Prester John, who ruled a vast, fabulously wealthy kingdom somewhere in the east, beyond the lands of the Muslims. His kingdom was said to contain the fountain of youth, be made of emeralds, and be populated by the lost tribes of Israel. For a Europe deeply engaged in the Crusades and feeling besieged by Islamic powers, this was not just a fairy tale, it was a strategic hope. The existence of a mighty Christian ally in the rear of their enemies was a geopolitical fantasy that popes and kings were desperate to believe. Mapmakers, often working under royal patronage, were encouraged to place his kingdom prominently, first in Asia and later, when no one found him there, relocated to the depths of Africa. This wasn't just cartography, it was wishful thinking rendered in ink and vellum, a desperate prayer for an ally that directed real-world exploration and diplomacy for hundreds of years. The process of how these stories reached the mapmaker's desk was a recipe for distortion. A Venetian merchant might hear a story from a Persian sailor in a Levantine port, who had himself heard it from a Silk Road caravan guard who was recounting a tale his grandmother told him. Each telling added layers of exaggeration, mistranslation, and cultural interpretation. A very large lizard could become a dragon over 3 retellings. A tribe that used elaborate face paint could be transformed into a race of men with faces on their chests. The mapmaker, sitting in a scriptorium far from the bustle of international ports, had no way to verify any of it. His sources were these third or fourth hand accounts, copied and recopied by scribes who might misread a word or correct a detail they found unbelievable. He was trying to reconstruct a dinosaur from a single, heavily chewed bone. Faced with this avalanche of dubious information, the medieval cartographer made a calculated choice. When in doubt, lean toward the spectacular. A map was an expensive and prestigious object, often commissioned by a wealthy patron or a powerful institution. It needed to be impressive to tell a compelling story, to affirm the patron's worldview and spark the imagination of everyone who saw it. A blank space was a failure of imagination, but a space filled with a griffin or a golden city was a conversation starter. It showed the patron that the cartographer was omniscient, aware of all the world's wonders. This commercial and social pressure meant that the most outlandish stories often received the most prominent placement on the map. Accuracy was secondary to engagement, a principle that feels uncomfortably familiar in our own age of viral misinformation and algorithmic sensationalism. The struggle to find truth in a storm of second-hand narratives wasn't a medieval failure. It was a deeply human one, highlighting our enduring vulnerability to a good story, especially when it confirms what we already hope is true. Yet, even as they leaned on scripture and sensational traveler tales, medieval mapmakers were not working in an intellectual void. They had inherited a legacy of profound sophistication from the ancient world, a legacy they revered almost as much as the Bible itself. The names of classical authorities like Ptolemy, Pliny the Elder, and Strabo were spoken with immense respect in monastic scriptoriums and scholarly courts. These were the intellectual giants upon whose shoulders they tried to stand, even as the ground beneath them, the Roman world that had produced these geniuses, had long since crumbled away. The relationship these medieval creators had with their classical forebears was one of deep admiration tangled with profound misunderstanding, a partnership across the centuries that was as fruitful as it was frustrating. The most pivotal of these figures was undoubtedly Claudius Ptolemy, an Egyptian scholar writing in Roman Alexandria during the 2nd century. His monumental work, the Geography, was nothing short of revolutionary. It proposed a system for projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface using a grid of latitude and longitude. It contained thousands of coordinates for known locations, and most importantly, it argued for a methodology based on astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. For a medieval scholar stumbling upon this text, it must have felt like discovering the operator's manual for the planet. Here was a system that promised to bring order, precision, and scientific rigor to the messy art of depicting the world. The potential was staggering, but there was a catastrophic problem, a crack in the foundation of this classical knowledge that would distort its application for centuries. For much of the Middle Ages, Western European scholars did not possess the complete geography. They often had only the text, the dense, complex written descriptions, but were missing the accompanying maps that would have brought Ptolemy's coordinate system to life. It was like having the recipe for a spectacular cake, but no picture of what it was supposed to look like. They were trying to reconstruct a sophisticated map from a bewildering list of numbers and place names, all while filtering it through their own deeply Christian worldview. The result was a fascinating hybrid. A cartographer might carefully copy Ptolemy's list of cities and their coordinates onto a fresh sheet of parchment, but then he would overlay this mathematical grid onto a traditional T and O framework, with Jerusalem firmly at the center and the Garden of Eden at the top. He was trying to fit the square peg of empirical science into the round hole of divine order, creating a map that was mathematically informed but theologically mandated. The grid became less a tool for accuracy and more a symbol of authority, a visual cue that the map was scientific because it paid homage to the great Ptolemy, even if his core principles were being quietly ignored. This reverence for ancient texts often actively stifled new discoveries. If an Arab trader or a returning crusader brought back a first-hand account that contradicted what Pliny had written about the source of the Nile or the shape of India, the instinct was to distrust the eyewitness, not the ancient authority. The classical author had been vetted by time and countless scholars. The traveler was just one man with a tall tale. This created a powerful intellectual inertia. Why risk innovation and potential heresy when you could simply copy, amend, and elaborate on the work of a certified genius from antiquity? This slavish devotion meant that errors from classical texts were faithfully reproduced for generations. For instance, Ptolemy had dramatically overestimated the length of the Mediterranean Sea and underestimated the circumference of the Earth. These miscalculations were copied onto medieval maps and would later famously influence Christopher Columbus, who used them to argue that sailing west to Asia was a feasible journey. Yet to dismiss this as simple ignorance is to miss the point entirely. The classical framework, for all its misapplication, provided an essential scaffolding for a collapsed world. In the face of near-total geographic isolation, the works of Ptolemy and Pliny offered a structured way to even think about the world. They provided categories for organizing information, from types of landforms to classifications of peoples. They gave medieval scholars a language and a system, a starting point from which they could begin their own process of creation. This classical foundation acted as a crucial bridge, carrying the embers of scientific inquiry and systematic thought through the long night of the early Middle Ages, preserving them so they could be fanned into the flames of the Renaissance. The medieval mapmakers were not blind followers. They were preservers and adapters, doing the best they could with the shattered pieces of a past civilization, trying to make them fit a world those classical authors could never have imagined. Their struggle was not between faith and science, but between the powerful urge to create a coherent picture of the world and the limited, contradictory information they had to work with. This deep commitment to symbolism meant that every single element on a medieval map, from the largest continent to the smallest illustration, was charged with intentional meaning. A river snaking across the parchment was rarely just a waterway. It could represent the flow of time from creation to apocalypse, the spiritual journey of a pilgrim, or a political boundary sanctioned by God. Mountains weren't merely topographical features. They were often depicted as jagged, moral obstacles or as the sacred sites of divine revelation, like Mount Sinai. Even the choice of animals was symbolic. Lions might represent the strength of a particular kingdom, while lambs could denote a region known for its piety or its passivity. The map was a complex visual language, and to read it was to decode a layered message about the world's spiritual and political order. Color was one of the most powerful tools in this symbolic lexicon. Unlike the standardized palettes of modern cartography, medieval colors were a code. Gold leaf and bright yellow were almost exclusively reserved for the holy, the halo of Christ, the walls of Jerusalem, or the location of paradise itself, making these areas shimmer with divine importance. Red, a costly pigment often made from crushed insects, was used to signal danger, martyrdom, or imperial power, drawing the eye to critical warnings or the seats of mighty emperors. Blue, derived from precious lapis lazuli, frequently denoted water but could also represent truth and heaven. Green might indicate fertile lands or places of earthly delight, while black could mark the unknown or the demonic. This chromatic code allowed an illiterate viewer to instantly understand the relative safety, sanctity, or significance of a region without needing to decipher a single word of Latin. The map communicated through visual splendor. its beauty directly tied to its message. Perhaps the most striking example of this symbolic worldview is the Ebstorf map, a massive 13th century Mapa Mundi that was tragically destroyed during World War II. This map didn't just place Christ in the world, it presented the entire world as the body of Christ. The map was oriented with east at the top, and Christ's head was depicted in that direction, with his hands at the north and south and his feet to the west. Jerusalem was positioned at the center of the map, which correspondingly placed it at the navel of Christ's body. Every city, every river, every creature existed within this encompassing divine presence. It was the ultimate statement of belief. The universe was not a random collection of matter but a literal embodiment of God, and geography was a testament to his omnipresence and sacrifice. A map like this was not a tool for travel. It was an object for profound theological meditation, a visual aid for contemplating the connection between the Creator and his creation. This prioritization of metaphor over measurement had significant practical consequences, because correcting a geographical error might mean altering a symbolic truth. Inaccuracies could become frozen in time. A coastline might be drawn incorrectly for generations because its shape had come to symbolize a biblical story. The Nile River, for instance, was almost always shown with a peculiar delta featuring 7 branches, not because anyone had accurately surveyed it, but because the number 7 held immense biblical significance. It represented perfection and completion. To draw it with the correct number of distributaries would have felt theologically wrong, a violation of a higher order of truth. This reveals the core of the medieval mapmaker's mindset. The primary purpose of a map was not to guide a traveler from point A to point B, but to guide a soul toward a correct understanding of its place in a God-ordered universe. Practicality was a secondary concern, a small price to pay for creating a document that affirmed the most important truths as they understood them. If you wanted to create the ultimate expression of the medieval mind, a single document that wove together every strand of faith, myth, history, and fear into one breathtaking tapestry, you would end up with something very much like the Herford Mapa Mundi. Created around the year 1300 and surviving to this day in Hereford Cathedral in England, this map is not merely a historical artifact, it is a portal. To stand before its 5.5-foot wide expanse of calfskin vellum is to be invited to a grand lecture on the nature of existence, delivered not with words but with ink, gold leaf, and a staggering depth of imagination. It is the world, but not as we know it. It is the world as it was understood, a cosmic diagram where every location holds a story and every story points toward a divine truth. The map's very structure is a sermon. It is a classic T&O map, a circle of the world with east placed firmly at the top. But this simple framework explodes into a dense encyclopedia of everything. At the very center, as it must be, sits the city of Jerusalem, the spiritual and geographical heart of all creation. Radiating out from this sacred core is a universe of meaning. Directly above it, at the top of the map, is the Garden of Eden, shown as a circular island surrounded by a wall of fire, complete with Adam, Eve, the serpent, and the tempting fruit. The story of humanity's fall is thus literally positioned above and before all other history, the original event from which everything else flows. To the right, you find the crucifixion, the moment of redemption, ensuring the map charts not just space, but the entire timeline of salvation. The artist, likely a team of scribes and illustrators working under a learned cleric, populated this landscape with over 500 ink drawings, each a tiny window into a different story. Noah's Ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. The Tower of Babel stretches proudly toward the heavens. The Golden Fleece hangs in a tree in Colchis, while the Labyrinth of Crete contains the Minotaur. This is where the map's genius truly lies. It makes no distinction between what we would call history, myth, and scripture. The journey of the Israelites through the Red Sea is given the same cartographic weight as the adventures of Alexander the Great. For the medieval viewer, these were all part of a single, divinely authored narrative. The map presents a complete and coherent universe where biblical events, classical legends, and contemporary knowledge coexist without contradiction because they all served the same purpose: to illustrate the wonder and order of God's creation. And what of the places beyond the known? The edges of the map, the terra incognita, are where the medieval imagination runs most freely. Here, in the margins of the world, dwell the monstrous races described by Pliny and amplified by travelers' tales. The Blemii, with their faces on their chests, stand in Africa. The Cyopods, with their one giant foot, hop through Asia. The Panoti, whose ears are so large they can use them as blankets, shiver in the north. These were not included as jokes or mere curiosities. They served a vital theological and psychological function. They physically represented the concept of the unknown and the other. They marked the literal and figurative boundaries of the normal Christian world, showing that the further one traveled from the center in Jerusalem, the more strange and distorted God's creation became. They were warnings, wonders, and a way of asserting a comforting normality for those safe within the map's core. Ultimately, the Mapa Mundi was never intended to guide a traveler from London to Rome. It was designed to guide a soul through the cosmos. It was a teaching tool, a visual aid for priests to explain the interconnectedness of all things: the creation, the fall, the redemption, and the final judgment. To study it is to understand that for the medieval mind, there was no separation between the physical and the spiritual. A river was not just water, it was a symbol of time or a biblical reference. A city's location was not just a coordinate, it was a statement about its importance in God's plan. The Herford Mapa Mundi is therefore the ultimate case study. A perfect snapshot of a world you were to map. The earth was first and foremost to chart the divine. But these fantastical creatures were never meant to be simple decorations or the whimsical doodles of a bored artist. Every single monster and marvel had a job to do. They were a sophisticated visual language, a system of symbols that the mapmaker used to communicate complex ideas about danger, morality, and the very nature of reality to an audience that spanned from illiterate peasants to educated kings. A dragon coiled menacingly in the North Sea wasn't just a fun drawing. It was the equivalent of a flashing red warning light on a modern navigational chart. It told sailors that these waters were treacherous, prone to sudden storms, hidden rocks, or powerful currents that had claimed ships and lives. The monster was a symbol that packed an emotional punch far greater than any written notation could for a population that couldn't read. It was an early, brilliant form of data visualization, translating abstract peril into a tangible, fear-inducing image that a sailor would not easily forget. This practice of populating the unknown with the monstrous also served a powerful psychological and cultural purpose. By placing these bizarre and often terrifying beings in the far-off lands of Africa and Asia, the European mapmaker was drawing a powerful, implicit boundary between us and them. The world was neatly divided into a familiar, ordered, and Christian center, radiating out from Jerusalem, and a chaotic, pagan periphery teeming with unnatural life. The cynosphali, or dog-headed men, were not just a strange story. They were a representation of people who were considered so different, so outside the norm of God's creation, that they were literally less than human. They reinforced a sense of cultural and religious superiority for the map's intended European audience. It was a way of saying, Here at the center is civilization, order, and God's chosen people. Out there at the edges lies chaos, savagery, and a world that has fallen away from divine grace. These maps weren't just describing the world, they were prescribing a worldview, one that justified exploration, conversion, and later, colonization by framing foreign lands as realms in desperate need of European order and salvation. The sources for these incredible beings were as varied as the creatures themselves. Mapmakers acted like medieval librarians of the bizarre, pulling from an entire genre of popular texts known as bestiaries. These were illustrated volumes that described real and imagined animals, each with a heavy moral or allegorical lesson attached. A lion wasn't just a lion. Its habit of sleeping with its eyes open made it a symbol of Christ's eternal vigilance. A pelican, believed to feed its young with its own blood, was a direct metaphor for Christ's sacrifice. So when a mapmaker placed a pelican on his map, he wasn't just noting local wildlife, he was infusing that location with a layer of sacred meaning. Even more influential were the wildly popular travelogues, like the utterly fictional but widely believed travels of Sir John Manville. This text, a sensational compilation of myths and tall tales, described encounters with one-legged sauropods who used their giant foot as a sunshade and headless blemii who had their faces on their chests. For a mapmaker who had never traveled beyond his own county, why wouldn't he trust the account of a famous, supposedly well-traveled knight? These stories were treated as first-hand ethnography, and the creatures were dutifully charted onto the world, transforming rumor into cartographic fact. This deeply ingrained habit of filling blank spaces with our deepest fears and wildest hopes is a thread that runs straight through human history to our present day. We may have mapped every continent and charted every ocean, but we still possess our own terra incognita. The deep ocean trenches on our modern maps are often illustrated with giant squids and other mysterious, poorly understood leviathans because we simply don't know what truly lurks in those crushing depths. Our maps of outer space are populated not with dragons, but with the potential for alien life, black holes, and mysterious dark matter concepts that are just as awe-inspiring and terrifying to us as Prester John's kingdom was to a medieval peasant. We have simply swapped one set of marvels for another, proving that the human mind remains profoundly uncomfortable with a vacuum. We are compelled to project our anxieties, our curiosities, and our stories onto the empty spaces, turning a map from a mere tool of measurement into a rich tapestry of what we know, what we fear, and what we dream. The medieval mapmaker, in surrounding his world with monsters, was engaging in the most human of acts, using imagination to build a fence against the terrifying and wonderful vastness of the unknown. While the monks and scholars in their scriptoria were weaving together scripture and myth, a very different kind of map was being born in the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean. This was the world of commerce, not contemplation, and the maps it produced were designed for one brutally practical purpose: to make money. As trade networks like the Silk Road and the complex sea lanes of the Mediterranean expanded, they created a relentless demand for reliable, actionable geographical information. A merchant's survival and profit depended on knowing the precise location of a safe harbor, the turn of a coastline, or the direction of a reliable wind. They couldn't afford to have their cargo ships run aground because a map had placed a mythical paradise where a crucial headland should be. Out of this necessity emerged the Portolan chart, a stunningly accurate and pragmatic tool that represented a parallel universe of cartography, running in direct contrast to the symbolic Mappi Mundi. The word Portolan comes from the Italian word for a written sailing direction, and these charts were their visual equivalent, drawn on sheepskin or goatskin parchment. Their most striking feature is a web of meticulously drawn lines radiating from central compass roses. These are room lines, a constant bearing grid that allowed a navigator to plot a course from one port to another with remarkable precision. The coastlines themselves are rendered in breathtaking detail, with every bay, estuary, and promontory carefully illustrated and labeled. Inland areas, by contrast, are often left completely blank or filled with simple, decorative patterns. For the merchant captain, what lay inland was irrelevant. His world was the coast, and the Portolan chart was his flawless guide to it. These were not works of theology but of applied mathematics and direct observation, compiled from the hard-won experience of countless sailors. This flood of new, empirical data from merchants and travelers presented a profound dilemma for the scholarly mapmakers back in Europe. For centuries, their authority had been derived from ancient texts and theological certainty. Now, they were confronted with first-hand accounts and precise coastal charts that directly contradicted the fantastical creatures and misshapen continents on their own world maps. How could they reconcile the accurate report of a Genoese sailor who had actually been to the Black Sea with Pliny the Elder's description of one-legged men living there? The result was a period of fascinating and often awkward cartographic hybridity. The new information wasn't rejected outright, but it was often force-fitted into the old, symbolic frameworks, creating maps that were deeply schizophrenic in their accuracy. The magnificent Catalan Atlas of 1375, created by the Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques for the King of France, is the perfect embodiment of this tension. At first glance, its representation of the Mediterranean and Atlantic coastlines is stunningly modern, drawn with the precise, practical knowledge of a Portolan chart. You could almost use it to sail from Barcelona to Alexandria, but as your eye moves inland and eastward, the map undergoes a gradual transformation. The crisp lines give way to a world of illustration and legend. The Sahara Desert is traversed by a magnificent caravan of camels, led by a clearly identified figure, Mansa Musa, the immensely wealthy king of the Mali Empire, shown holding a golden orb. Further east, sitting in the heart of Asia, is the great Mongol ruler, the Kublai Khan, another figure drawn from the very real, updated political reports of the time. Yet, nestled alongside these surprisingly accurate depictions of real-world power, you still find the old myths. The lands of Gog and Magog are still locked away behind their mountains, and the Red Sea is still painted a brilliant, symbolic red. The Catalan Atlas doesn't choose between the old world and the new. It layers them on top of each other, creating a palimpsest of knowledge where the empirical and the legendary exist side by side. It is a map in transition, holding onto the comfort of myth even as it reluctantly embraces the undeniable power of fact. This hesitant integration reveals a deeper truth about how knowledge evolves. It is rarely a simple switch from wrong to right. Instead, new data is slowly and imperfectly absorbed into existing systems of belief. The medieval mapmaker, steeped in a tradition that valued symbolic truth, was often willing to accept new factual details only if they could be made to fit within his larger, pre-existing worldview. A newly discovered river was added to the map, but its course might be altered to flow from the Garden of Eden. A report of a powerful African king was included, but he might be depicted alongside a cynocephalus, as if both were equally valid descriptions of the continent. Trade, therefore, acted as the great disruptor. It was a constant, dripping tap of contradictory information that slowly eroded the foundations of mythical cartography. It forced the mapmakers to make compromises, to create these incredible hybrid documents that are, in their own way, more honest than a purely scientific map could ever be. They visually document the painful, exciting, and messy process of the world getting bigger and the human struggle to keep up. The pressure applied by trade and its practical maps didn't just add details. It initiated a slow-motion revolution that would eventually shatter the medieval worldview and pave the way for the Age of Discovery. Beneath the intricate illustrations of sea serpents and the precise lines of sacred geography lies a force even more fundamental than faith or folklore, a deep, universal human instinct. We are, as a species, profoundly uncomfortable with blank spaces, whether on a parchment page or in the architecture of our own minds. The medieval mapmaker, hunched over his vellum, was engaged in an act of psychological necessity. His world was one of immense and terrifying uncertainty. Plague could sweep through a city without warning, a harvest failure could mean starvation, and the vastness of the ocean or the forest represented genuine, life-threatening danger. In this context, a map was so much more than a guide. It was a shield against the abyss. By drawing a line around the known world and meticulously filling every remaining gap with something, be it a real mountain range or a mythical griffin, he was performing a magical act of containment. He was transforming a formless, chaotic, and frightening unknown into a named, categorized, and managed concept. The very act of mapping was an assertion of control, a way of shouting into the void that I am here, and I have defined what is out there. This compulsion to categorize the uncategorized is a thread that runs directly into modern cognitive science. Psychologists understand that the human brain is a relentless pattern-making machine. We simply cannot tolerate informational gaps. Our mental machinery automatically fills them in with assumptions, stereotypes, and best guesses. This is why we see faces in clouds or hear phantom words in random noise. Medieval world maps are the ultimate historical example of this cognitive process projected onto a physical object. Faced with the ultimate gap, the literal unknown reaches of the planet, the medieval mind filled them not with random scribbles, but with the most powerful patterns it knew, the resonant stories from its holy books, the thrilling tales from travelers, and the terrifying beasts from its collective nightmares. The map was an externalized, shared mental model, a collective coping mechanism that allowed an entire civilization to look at the terrifying scope of creation and say, "It is known." The comfort this provided cannot be overstated. In an age without the reassuring certainty of science to explain natural disasters or disease, the world could feel capricious and cruel. A map that placed Jerusalem at the center and showed God's omnipresent hand in the form of Christ's body on the Ebstorf map offered a profound antidote to this existential anxiety. It asserted that there was no such thing as true chaos, only a divine order that was sometimes mysterious to mortal eyes. Every storm, every drought, every strange creature in a distant land was part of a plan authored by a benevolent creator. This wasn't ignorance, it was a sophisticated form of meaning-making. The map was a visual promise that the universe was not random, and therefore one's life within it was not meaningless. It transformed the fear of the unknown into a fascinated reverence for God's elaborate and wondrous design. Yet, for all the comfort it offered, this act of mapping also contained the seeds of its own undoing. The same drive that FILLED Chinese letter with monsters also sparked an insatiable curiosity. By creating such a vivid and compelling picture of what might be out there, whether it was the golden spires of Prester John's kingdom or the fabled fountain of youth, these maps didn't just soothe anxiety, they actively manufactured desire. They became catalysts for ambition, fueling the dreams of merchants who saw new trade routes and kings who envisioned new empires. They turned the terra incognita from a place of pure dread into a place of potential wonder and unimaginable reward. This delicate balance between fear and fascination is the true engine of exploration. We are drawn to the edge of the map precisely because we have drawn something tantalizing there, proving that our need to define the unknown is inextricably linked to our need to eventually go and see it for ourselves. This medieval psychological drive has never left us. We've simply given it new tools and new territories. The deep ocean trenches on modern maps are today's equivalent of the edges of the Mapa, Mundi, poorly lit realms where we still chart potential sea monsters and strange life forms because we lack complete data. Our maps of the human genome are filled with vast regions once dismissively labeled junk DNA, a modern term for terra incognita that we are only now beginning to explore and understand. And in the digital realm, we are creating entirely new worlds to map, from the sprawling landscapes of massive online games to the complex architecture of artificial intelligence neural networks, which are often described as black boxes precisely because we don't fully understand their internal geography. In each case, we are repeating the same ancient ritual, facing a void, feeling that deep-seated psychological discomfort, and using the best tools and stories at our disposal to draw a line around it, name its features, and in doing so, make it just a little less terrifying. The medieval mapmaker's quill has been replaced by a satellite sensor and a programmer's code, but the mind holding the tool is the same, forever driven to illuminate the darkness at the edge of the known world. But what did it actually take to transform these grand cosmological ideas into a physical object you could unroll on a table? The process was a world away from the click of a mouse or the whir of a printer. It was a painstaking, collaborative, and remarkably tactile craft. The medieval mapmaker's workshop was a fascinating blend of the scholarly and the artistic, a place where complex calculations met the messy, physical reality of animal skin, handmade ink, and the steady, patient hand of a scribe. The first and most crucial decision was the canvas itself. While paper was known, having traveled from China through the Islamic world, the preferred material for a prestigious, durable map was always vellum or parchment, both terms for treated animal skin, typically from a calf, sheep, or goat. This was an expensive and labor-intensive product. The skin had to be soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried, then carefully cut and prepared to form a smooth, uniform sheet. The very choice of this material influenced the map's design. A large world map like the Hereford Mapa Mundi required the skins of multiple animals meticulously stitched together to form a single, massive sheet. You can still see the seams on these ancient documents, a subtle reminder of the living creatures that formed their foundation. Once the parchment was ready, the real work of creation could begin, and it was almost never a solo endeavor. A single monk or scholar might conceive of the map's overall scheme, but its execution was a team effort. A draftsman, perhaps using a simple compass divider and a straightedge, might lay down the basic T and O structure, or, if they were feeling adventurous, a faint grid system inspired by a misunderstood reading of Ptolemy. Then a scribe would carefully letter in the hundreds, sometimes thousands, of place names in a clear, legible hand, often using a dark, carbon-based ink made from soot or crushed gallnuts. Finally, the Illuminator would take over, the true artist who brought the map to life with a vibrant palette of colors ground from minerals and plants. Rich red came from crushed insects or red lead, deep blue from precious lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, green from copper salts, and a shining, celestial gold leaf was carefully applied to highlight the most sacred sites. This division of labor meant that a single map was a fusion of different skills and interpretations, a fact that inevitably introduced errors. A tired scribe might miscopy a name from his source text, or an enthusiastic illustrator might place a sea monster slightly off course, and these mistakes would then be faithfully reproduced by the next mapmaker who used this one as his source. For the few who strove for a more scientific approach, the toolkit was limited but ingenious. The magnetic compass, arriving in Europe from China via Arab traders in the 12th or 13th century, was a genuine revolution. It allowed for the creation of the portolan charts, with their mesmerizing webs of room lines all radiating from central wind roses that showed the 32 principal directions. To determine latitude, the north-south position, a navigator or ambitious scholar might use an astrolabe or a cross staff. These complex brass instruments or simple wooden sticks were used to measure the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. In theory, this could provide a reasonably accurate measurement of how far north or south you were. In practice, for a mapmaker working in a stationary scriptorium hundreds of miles from the sea, applying these precise measurements to a world map was incredibly difficult. They might have a precise latitude for Alexandria from an ancient text, but how did that relate to the shape of Spain or the width of Africa? The result was often a frustrating inconsistency, where one part of a map might be drawn with surprising accuracy based on a sailor's bearing, while another region was wildly distorted to fit a biblical description or a classical legend. Yet within these constraints, their creativity shone through in the form of brilliant cartographic innovations. The wind rose, that beautiful compass star that became the heart of every portolan chart, is a perfect example. It was an elegant information graphic that condensed complex navigational data into an instantly understandable visual guide. The use of color coding, while deeply symbolic, also served a practical organizational purpose, helping the eye quickly differentiate between kingdoms, languages, or types of terrain. They developed elaborate and unique cartouches decorative frames to contain the title or the mapmaker's name, turning a simple label into a work of art. And perhaps most importantly, they perfected the art of the visual hierarchy. On a crowded map, the most important places weren't just labeled, they were drawn larger, given more elaborate illustrations or highlighted in gold. This meant that even an illiterate viewer's eye would be immediately drawn to Jerusalem, Rome, or Paris, understanding their significance through size and splendor rather than text. Every choice, from the grind of a pigment to the curl of a sea serpent's tail, was a deliberate step in the monumental task of building a world from scratch, a testament to the profound human urge to create order and beauty with nothing but the simplest of tools and the power of an inquisitive mind. While the bustling port cities gave rise to the pragmatic portolan chart, a quieter, more contemplative form of mapmaking was flourishing behind the thick stone walls of monasteries scattered across Europe. These secluded religious communities became the unexpected but essential librarians and engineers of the medieval world's geographical imagination. In an age of recurring invasions, political fragmentation, and the scarcity of stable, secular institutions, monasteries served as fortified arks of knowledge. Within their scriptoriums, rooms dedicated solely to the labor of writing and illumination, monks undertook the monumental task of preserving the intellectual heritage of the past, including the fragile and precious art of cartography. This was not a hobby or a side project. It was a core part of their devotional and scholarly duty, a practice known as ora et labora, prayer, and work where the act of copying a text was itself a form of meditation and worship. The daily routine of a monk cartographer was one of immense discipline and painstaking effort. His workspace was the scriptorium, a large room often heated by only a small fireplace or braziers, with desks positioned to catch the maximum available light from windows. Here, in a silence broken only by the scratching of quills and the occasional soft instruction, teams of scribes and illustrators worked for months, sometimes years, on a single manuscript. The process began with the procurement of the finest parchment, prepared from the skin of calves, sheep, or goats. Then, a lead point or a piece of plummet would be used to rule the lines and faintly sketch the map's outline. The scribe would then take up a quill, sharpening it repeatedly with a small knife to carefully ink the text and the basic forms. Finally, the illuminator, often the most skilled artist among them, would apply the vibrant colors. He worked from a palette of pigments that read like a poem of the earth itself. Ochre and orpiment for yellows, verdigris for green, precious ultramarine blue ground from lapis lazuli, and the most expensive of all, burnished gold leaf, which was painstakingly applied to represent the divine light of holy cities and sacred figures. Their primary source material was a fragile chain of knowledge stretching back to antiquity. The most prized possession in any monastic library was a copy of a classical text, like Pliny the Elder's Natural History or the Holy Grail of Geography, Ptolemy's Geography. The task of the monk was not to question these authorities, but to faithfully reproduce them. However, faithful reproduction in a medieval context did not mean slavish, photographic copying. It was an act of interpretation. As a monk copied Ptolemy's coordinates and descriptions, he faced a constant tension. How could he reconcile the pagan Greeks' spherical earth and coordinate grid with the established Christian TO model that placed Jerusalem at the center of a flat, disc-shaped world? The solution was a fascinating compromise. A monk might carefully copy Ptolemy's list of cities and their latitudes, but then he would superimpose that data onto a map that was clearly oriented with east and paradise at the top. He might include the classical wind directions or the climatic zones, but then illustrate the edges of the map with the monstrous races described in the Bible. This was knowledge preservation through a theological filter, ensuring that even pagan science ultimately served to illustrate the glory and order of God's creation. This deeply ingrained perspective meant that the maps produced in these religious centers, like the beautiful and enigmatic Cotton World Map, served a purpose far beyond navigation. They were first and foremost spiritual instruments. A monastery-produced map was designed to guide the soul, not the body. It emphasized the routes of pilgrimage, the path to Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela over the routes of merchants. It lavished detail on the location of saintly relics, the sites of biblical miracles, and the seats of powerful bishops. The physical world was presented as a testing ground for the Christian soul, a temporary landscape through which one journeyed on the path to salvation. The practical needs of a sailor looking for a safe harbor or a merchant calculating the distance between markets were entirely secondary to the map's function as a visual sermon. It taught theology, reinforced doctrine, and reminded the viewer that every mountain and river was part of a divine plan. The influence of this monastic cartography cannot be overstated. For centuries, these were the only world maps in existence, and they fundamentally shaped the European consciousness. They presented a vision of the world that was coherent, ordered, and comforting, where Christendom was central and safe, and the unknown margins were wild but ultimately under God's control. This worldview, meticulously copied and disseminated from one monastery to another, provided a shared mental geography for kings, popes, and peasants alike. It was a map that justified the Crusades, inspired pilgrims, and offered a definitive answer to the question of humanity's place in the universe. The quiet, diligent work of these anonymous monk cartographers, etching their faith onto parchment, did more than just preserve old knowledge. They built the conceptual cage that would both comfort and constrain European thought until a new age of exploration finally arrived to bend and break its bars. Yet for all their spiritual intention and artistic wonder, these maps were never impartial mirrors of the world. They were instead powerful mirrors of the minds that created them, and those minds were steeped in the prejudices and power structures of medieval Europe. Every coastline drawn, every monster placed, every city enlarged was a conscious or unconscious choice that reflected a specific worldview, one that placed Latin Christendom at the apex of civilization and portrayed everything beyond its borders as increasingly strange, dangerous, and inferior. This wasn't just a matter of artistic license, it was a systematic process of othering, a cartographic justification for the emerging ideologies of crusade and later colonialism. The mapmaker's pen became a tool of soft power, sketching the boundaries of us and them long before any ship could sail to enforce them. This bias is most starkly visible in the very structure of the world maps. Europe, though geographically smaller than Asia or Africa, is almost always given a disproportionate amount of space and detail. It is rendered with a familiarity and precision that suggests a place known and controlled. Jerusalem sits at the center not just for theological reasons, but because it positioned the Christian world as the literal heart of all creation. Now, follow the lines outward from that center. As you move south into Africa or east into Asia, the cartography undergoes a deliberate shift. The precise coastlines give way to a wild interior teeming with fantastical creatures. The Citopodes, a race of men with feet like parrots, shuffle through the heat. The Cynosphali, with their dog heads and savage habits, are shown feasting on raw meat. These were not innocent decorations. They were a visual language of dehumanization, suggesting that the further one traveled from the heart of Christendom, the less human God's creation became. These monstrous races served a crucial political purpose. They framed non-Christian, non-European peoples as subhuman, making the concepts of holy war and forced conversion not just palatable, but a moral duty. The language used on these maps reinforces this divisive hierarchy. The term Ethiopia is a prime example. For medieval scholars, this was a catch-all term pulled from classical texts, used not just for the kingdom we know today, but as a broad, vague label for the entire continent of Africa and its inhabitants. It erased the incredible diversity of thousands of distinct cultures, kingdoms, and languages, lumping them all into a single, othered category. Similarly, the vast and sophisticated civilizations of Asia were often reduced to the domains of the Great Khan or Prester John, powerful but ultimately exotic and enigmatic figures, their complexity flattened into a simple legend. This linguistic shorthand made the world easier for a European audience to categorize and, crucially, to dismiss. It's much simpler to justify dominating a land if you've already defined its people as a monstrous, homogeneous mass rather than as complex societies with their own rich histories and rites. These weren't harmless fantasies confined to parchment. They were active ingredients in the recipe for real-world conflict and exploitation. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, he didn't just use theology. He invoked a geography of threat and sacred reclaiming, a vision of the world that these maps had helped to popularize. Centuries later, when Portuguese explorers began creeping down the coast of West Africa, they carried with them maps that had prepared them to expect monstrous races and godless savages. This preconception directly influenced their brutal policies of enslavement and conquest. They were not encountering fellow human beings, but subhuman creatures who could be dominated without moral consequence. The map had drawn the target, and the explorers' sword and shackles followed. The cartographic bias of the scriptorium became a blueprint for violence on the shore. Confronting this uncomfortable truth is not about judging the past by modern standards, but about understanding the profound and often dangerous link between representation and reality. The medieval mapmaker, often a devout monk, likely saw his work as a celebration of God's creation, not an act of prejudice. Yet, by using his art to project European fears and feelings of superiority onto the rest of the world, he participated in creating a narrative that had devastating consequences. This legacy is an urgent reminder as we navigate our own era of digital mapping and data visualization. The algorithms that power our modern maps are not neutral either. They are created by people with their own cultural perspectives and can perpetuate hidden biases, from erasing certain neighborhoods to prioritizing certain routes. The lesson from the medieval mapmakers is that every map is an argument. It makes a case for what is important, what is normal, and what is other. To read any map critically, whether drawn on calfskin or rendered on a smartphone, is to ask not just what it shows us, but who drew it, what they believed, and what they hoped their world would become. Yet, even as the monastic scriptorium reached its peak of symbolic expression, powerful forces were gathering beyond its stone walls that would forever shatter the medieval world picture. The catalyst for this great unraveling was not a single event but a perfect storm of intellectual, technological, and economic currents that converged in the 14th and 15th centuries. The first was a simple, physical expansion of the known world. The Pax Mongolica had briefly opened the Silk Road, allowing European merchants and missionaries like Marco Polo and William of Rubruck to travel deeper into Asia than ever before, returning with accounts that directly contradicted the monstrous races and mythical kingdoms drawn on traditional maps. Their reports described organized empires, sophisticated cities, and vast, ordinary landscapes, a world that was different, but not monstrous. This steady drip of contradictory eyewitness testimony began to corrode the authority of the ancient texts that had been the mapmaker's gospel for centuries. The most profound shock to the system, however, came not from a traveler's tale, but from a rediscovered book. For over 1,000 years, European scholars had possessed only fragments and flawed copies of Claudius Ptolemy's 2nd century masterpiece, the Geography. Then, around 1400, a complete Greek copy arrived in Florence from Constantinople. When it was translated into Latin, it was nothing short of an intellectual detonation. Here was a work that treated cartography not as a branch of theology, but as a mathematical science. Ptolemy provided a precise coordinate system of latitude and longitude, and most importantly, detailed instructions for projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface. This was the missing manual. It gave scholars a rigorous, systematic method to replace the symbolic T and O framework. The impact was immediate and electrifying. For the first time, mapmakers had a tool that allowed them to incorporate new discoveries into a scalable, proportional grid, where every new piece of data could find its logical place. This intellectual revolution was supercharged by a technological one, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. For centuries, maps had been unique, hand-copied objects, expensive to produce and prone to error with each new reproduction. The printing press changed everything. Now, a map could be typeset and printed in identical copies by the hundreds, drastically reducing its cost and increasing its availability. More importantly, it allowed for the rapid and accurate dissemination of new knowledge. When a Portuguese caravel returned from exploring the coast of Africa, the new geographical information it brought back could be quickly incorporated into a woodblock or copper plate and distributed across Europe, where other mapmakers would use it to update their own work. Knowledge began to evolve in real time, creating a feedback loop where exploration fueled better maps, and better maps, in turn, fueled further exploration. The map was no longer a static, sacred artifact. It had become a living, updating document. The fascinating tension of this transitional period is perfectly captured in Martin Behaim's Erdapfel, or Earth Apple, created in 1492, the very year Columbus set sail. Behaim's globe is a beautiful and confused hybrid, a creature with one foot in the medieval past and the other in the Renaissance future. It is the oldest surviving terrestrial globe, a form itself that acknowledges the Earth's sphericity, and it ambitiously attempts to plot the world using Ptolemaic principles and the latest reports from Portuguese explorers. The coast of Africa is rendered with surprising, though still flawed, accuracy, reflecting the recent voyages that had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Yet, clinging stubbornly to these emerging realities are the ghosts of the Old World. The globe prominently features the mythical island of St. Brendan, a paradisiacal land from Irish folklore. It places the island of Sipangu, Japan, absurdly far out into the Atlantic Ocean, a miscalculation based on a misreading of Marco Polo that would ironically encourage Columbus in his fateful voyage. The Erdapfel doesn't choose between myth and measurement. It desperately tries to hold both in its hands, a stunning visual record of a world cracking under the weight of new evidence. Driving this entire enterprise was a new kind of patron with a new set of priorities, the nation-state. Figures like Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, understood that accurate maps were not just scholarly curiosities, they were instruments of immense power and wealth. Under his direction, the Portuguese court became a clearinghouse for geographic knowledge, systematically collecting data from captains, bribing foreign pilots, and commissioning ever more precise portolan charts and maps. Their goal was ruthlessly practical: to find a sea route to the spice sources of India, bypassing the Muslim middlemen who controlled the overland routes. This state-sponsored, goal-oriented exploration stood in stark contrast to the monastic mapmaking of the past. The question was no longer, what does God's plan for the world look like? But how do we get to the Moluccas and back as fast as possible? This shift from metaphysical inquiry to material gain provided the relentless funding and focus that accelerated the cartographic revolution. The map was becoming a weapon of commerce and empire. The old medieval imagination did not vanish in a puff of smoke. It retreated slowly, its mythical creatures scurrying to the margins of the parchment, and then, eventually, off the page entirely. For a time, mapmakers like Gerardus Mercator continued to decorate the empty interiors of continents with elaborate cartouches, lions, and elephants, but these were now openly acknowledged as decoration, not geography. The sea monsters that had once warned of very real nautical dangers were replaced by meticulously drawn lines of room and notations of water depth. The shift was not a clean break but a long, slow receding tide, where each new voyage, each new printed atlas, washed away a little more of the fantastic and left a little more of the factual in its place. This transition was less about the triumph of science over superstition and more about the painful, exhilarating process of learning to trust the evidence of the eye over the wisdom of the ancients. It was the dawn of a new relationship with the world, one built not on faith alone, but on the audacious belief that the truth was something you could find for yourself, if only you had the courage to sail toward the edge of the map and see what was really there. Yet the legacy of these maps extends far beyond the shelves of rare book libraries, weaving itself directly into the very fabric of our modern imagination. The most direct and beloved descendants of the Mapa Mundi are undoubtedly the maps that unfold in the front of fantasy novels. When J.R.R. Tolkien, a scholar deeply steeped in Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythology, set out to create Middle-earth, he didn't just write a story, he drew its world first. His maps, with their elegant calligraphy, wandering mountain ranges, and carefully placed forests, are a conscious echo of the medieval tradition. Places like the Old Forest or the Dead Marshes aren't just locations. They are realms of psychological and moral significance, much like the regions on a medieval map that warned of spiritual danger or earthly temptation. The simple phrase, "Here be dragons," is perhaps the most famous cartographic cliché in history, a direct lift from the Latin "Hc esvinti dracones," found on the 16th century Lennox globe. Tolkien understood that a map wasn't just a guide for his characters, but a portal for his readers, a promise of a world so complete and richly imagined that it had its own geography, its own history, and its own unexplored edges waiting for a story to happen. This tradition of world building through cartography has become the absolute bedrock of the fantasy genre, and the video games it inspires. Open the case for any major role-playing game like The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, or The Witcher 3, and you are likely to find a physical map printed on parchment-style paper, complete with burnt edges and a faux-aged texture. Within the games themselves, the in-game maps are often works of art. Towns are not represented by simple dots but by tiny illustrated buildings. Dangerous areas are shaded with ominous colors or marked with skulls, a direct digital evolution of the sea serpents that once warned medieval sailors. These aren't sterile GPS systems, they are narrative devices. The act of uncovering the fog of war on a game map is the modern equivalent of a medieval cartographer filling a blank space with a creature from a bestiary. It's an act of discovery and imagination. The map itself becomes a quest log, a story summary, and a piece of the world's soul, all rolled into one. It teaches players to see the game world not as a series of tasks to be completed, but as a landscape to be understood and felt, a direct inheritance from the medieval view of geography as a place of meaning. But this influence isn't confined to the realm of pure fantasy. The principles of medieval map-making, the use of symbolism, the prioritization of story over strict accuracy, and the layering of information are everywhere in our daily digital lives. Think about the last time you used a food delivery app. Your location isn't just a point on a grid. It's represented by a little avatar of yourself. The restaurant might be marked by an illustrated icon of a steaming bowl of noodles, and the delivery driver might be a cartoon car moving in real time. This isn't just cute graphics. It's a form of modern symbolism not unlike the use of gold leaf for holy cities. The app is using visual language to make abstract data GPS coordinates, estimated travel times immediately understandable and emotionally resonant. Similarly, a weather map uses a color spectrum from blue to red to communicate danger and safety, a direct descendant of the medieval cartographer's palette where red signified peril and blue represented truth or water. Even the ubiquitous "you are here" dot on a shopping mall directory is a simplified, symbolic way to orient ourselves in a complex space, a tiny echo of Jerusalem's placement at the center of the medieval world, giving us comfort by showing us our place in the universe, however small that universe may be. Ultimately, the enduring power of these ancient documents lies in their profound humanity. A satellite image can show us every tree, every building, every street with cold, impersonal precision. But a medieval map and the modern creations it inspires shows us how people feel about a place. It tells us what they feared, what they worshipped, what they dreamed of finding, and what stories they told themselves to make sense of a vast and bewildering world. They are historical artifacts of unparalleled value because they capture a mindset, a worldview frozen in ink and vellum. By studying them, we aren't just learning outdated geography. We are engaging in a conversation with our ancestors, connecting with a time when the act of creation was an act of faith and wonder. They remind us that every map we make today, from the schematics of a metro system to the fictional chart of a starship, is more than just a tool for navigation. It is a story we are telling about ourselves, our priorities, and our place in the cosmos, a testament to the timeless human urge to not only find our way, but to understand what it means to be on the journey at all. But this practice of populating the unknown with the monstrous raises a profound and unsettling ethical question that echoes across the centuries. When a medieval cartographer dipped his quill into ink and drew a cynocephalus, a dog-headed man, in the heart of Africa, what was he truly doing? On one hand, he was simply filling a blank space with the best information available to him, a composite of classical authority and traveler rumor. There was likely no conscious malice in the act, yet on the other, he was participating in a system of representation that had devastating real-world consequences. These were not harmless doodles, they were powerful visual propaganda that dehumanized entire populations, framing foreign peoples as subhuman savages, as part of the monstrous other that existed beyond the light of Christian civilization. This cartographic othering didn't just describe a worldview, it actively helped to create and justify one. It provided a moral and intellectual framework for the horrors of the slave trade, for the brutal excesses of the Crusades, and for the colonial mindset that would later rationalize the exploitation of entire continents. The map became a silent accomplice to conquest, whispering to kings and explorers that the lands they sought to dominate were not inhabited by fellow human beings with complex cultures and rights, but by monstrous aberrations in need of subjugation or salvation. We must, however, resist the easy temptation to simply condemn these long-dead mapmakers as prejudiced or ignorant. To do so is to commit the same error of decontextualization that they did. They were products of an intensely insular and hierarchical society, one where the concept of cultural relativism simply did not exist. Their worldview was a closed loop, reinforced by the authority of the Church and the ancient texts they revered. Their primary sources were often centuries-old manuscripts written by authors who had their own axes to grind and biases to promote. A mapmaker in a French monastery had no way to video call a scholar in Timbuktu to verify a report. He was working with shattered fragments of information, and his ethical framework was bounded by the limits of his experience and his unwavering belief in a divinely ordained hierarchy with Europe at its apex. His intent was likely not to slander, but to create a complete and coherent picture of God's creation in all its supposed variety, a variety that included the monstrous as a testament to the wonders and warnings of that creation. This crucial distinction between conscious malevolence and unconscious bias is the heart of the ethical dilemma. This medieval duality holds up a dark mirror to our own time, revealing that the urge to map the unfamiliar with our own fears and prejudices is a deeply human trait, not a medieval one. We may have banished the Sinos folly from our geographical maps, but have we truly exorcised them from our mental and digital ones? Consider the modern practice of data mapping. When we create a heat map of crime statistics that overwhelmingly highlights certain neighborhoods, are we presenting objective fact, or are we, through our choices of data sets, color palettes, and scale, creating a modern monster that stigmatizes an entire community? When an algorithm powering a navigation app consistently routes traffic away from a low-income area, is it optimizing for efficiency, or is it unconsciously codifying and reinforcing decades of socioeconomic bias and racial redlining? These digital maps carry the immense authority of science and data, making their hidden biases even more insidious and persuasive than a plainly drawn medieval monster. They are the new Mundi, and we are their creators, often blind to the ethical weight of the patterns we choose to visualize and those we choose to ignore. The ethical lesson etched into these ancient parchments is not that we should stop making maps, but that we must approach the act of cartography with profound humility and relentless self-awareness. Every map is an argument. It is an argument about what is important, what is normal, what is safe, and what is dangerous. The medieval map argued for a world ordered by faith and fear. Our maps, whether of social networks, political affiliations, or global supply chains, argue for a world ordered by data and algorithms. The responsibility lies in acknowledging that these arguments are never neutral. They are built on choices about what to include, what to exclude, how to classify, and how to symbolize. The quest for ethical cartography, then, is a quest for transparency about those choices. It means actively seeking out missing perspectives, questioning our data sources, and understanding that the most accurate map is not necessarily the one with the most detail, but the one that most honestly acknowledges its own limitations and biases. It is a continuous effort to ensure that our maps serve to illuminate the world in all its complex reality, rather than to justify the monsters we have always feared might be there. This beautiful tension between science and art wasn't a conflict for the medieval mapmaker. It was the very essence of his craft. He saw no dividing line between the objective and the subjective, the measured and the magnificent. In his workshop, a compass for drawing perfect circles sat alongside a pot of ultramarine blue made from crushed lapis lazuli. A ruler for straight lines shared a desk with a brush for gilding Jerusalem in shimmering gold leaf. The goal was never merely to record data, but to create a complete cosmography, a single object that could explain the world in all its dimensions, from the mathematical to the metaphysical. This required a Renaissance mind centuries before the Renaissance, a thinker who could hold multiple ways of knowing in his hand at once. The scientific elements provided the skeleton of the map. They were the underlying structure, the attempt to impose a rational order on a chaotic world. This might be the faint grid lines borrowed from a misunderstood Ptolemaic manuscript, a careful effort to scale continents relative to one another based on the best estimates of travel time from merchants' logs. It was the precise rendering of a coastline on a Portolan chart, where the accurate angle of a bay could mean the difference between a safe landing and a shipwreck. This was the mapmaker in his role as a scientist, a collector and organizer of empirical evidence, however scarce it might have been, but the science of the age was simply too weak to stand on its own. The data was too fragmentary, the tools too crude, the blank spaces too vast. This is where the artist stepped in to complete the picture. Where knowledge failed, imagination and faith took over. The artist's role was to clothe the bare skeleton of facts in the rich flesh of meaning and narrative. A vast, unexplored ocean wasn't left empty. It was filled with a magnificent leviathan, its coils twisting through the waves. This wasn't a lie, it was a different kind of truth. It communicated the ocean's perceived danger and mystery far more effectively than a blank space or the words, "Here there be monsters," ever could. A river might be drawn wider than scale permitted, not out of error, but to emphasize its importance as a trade route or a spiritual boundary. Color was never arbitrary. The use of expensive gold leaf for Paradise or Jerusalem wasn't just decorative. It was a visual hierarchy, screaming the theological importance of these sites to a viewer who might not be able to read the Latin labels. The artist was the master of visual metaphor, turning a map into a symbolic language that could be read on multiple levels by both a learned scholar and an illiterate peasant. This fusion solved a very practical problem: how to make complex, layered information engaging, memorable, and accessible to a broad audience. A dry list of coordinates or a bare-bones outline of landmasses would have held little interest or utility for most people. But a map that was also a masterpiece of illumination, that could captivate a king, inspire a pilgrim, and terrify a sailor all at once. It was a tool for teaching, for preaching, and for navigation, all woven into one breathtaking tapestry. The decorative elements themselves were often packed with functional data. An elaborate wind rose wasn't just a beautiful star-shaped design at the center of a portolan chart. It was a precise navigational instrument, its lines radiating out to show sailors the 32 principal directions. The intricate drawings of cities weren't merely pretty pictures. The size and grandeur of the illustration often denoted the city's actual importance and wealth. A tiny, detailed ship drawn sailing along a trade route wasn't just filler. It indicated a well-used and safe passage for merchants. The medieval mapmaker understood a fundamental truth that we are desperately relearning in our age of information overload, that for knowledge to stick, it must appeal to the heart as well as the head. We see this principle reborn all around us today in the field of data visualization. The most effective infographics don't just present statistics, they tell a story with them. They use color, shape, and illustration to create an emotional connection and make complex data instantly understandable. A modern graph about climate change might use a warming color palette of reds and oranges to viscerally communicate rising temperatures. An interactive map tracking global migration might use flowing, river-like lines to create a sense of movement and story. This is the direct descendant of the medieval impulse to make information beautiful and meaningful. They knew that rigor without creativity is often impenetrable, and that creativity without rigor is merely decoration. The greatest challenge and the greatest achievement of their work was in weaving the two together into a single, inseparable whole, creating documents that guided, inspired, and awed in equal measure, reminding us that the most complete picture of our world always requires both a keen eye for detail and a soul full of wonder. And so we arrive at one of history's greatest ironies, that these maps, so often wrong in their details, were so powerfully right in their ability to inspire action. The very inaccuracies and embellishments that modern cartographers might dismiss as failures were, in fact, the medieval mapmakers' most potent and unintended success. They did not just document the world as it was known, they advertised the world as it might be, filling the blank spaces not with emptiness but with irresistible possibility. This was not a bug in the system. It was a feature of the medieval mindset, and it became the primary fuel for the engine of exploration that would reshape the globe. Consider the psychological power of a myth like El Dorado, the legendary city of gold. This was not some abstract fairy tale. On maps of the New World, it was often given a specific, tantalizing location, nestled somewhere in the unmapped interior of South America. For a conquistador like Gonzalo Pizarro, poring over these charts in the 1540s, that cartographic promise was as real as the sword at his hip. It offered a tangible destination for his greed and ambition, a place he could actually march his army toward. His nightmarish expedition through the Amazon jungle, a disaster that cost hundreds of lives, was directly launched by a cartographic legend. And while he never found his gilded city, his brutal journey and countless others like it inadvertently mapped thousands of miles of previously unknown rivers, mountains, and indigenous territories. The quest for a fictional place yielded a wealth of very real, very valuable geographical knowledge. The error on the parchment compelled the boots on the ground, and the ground, in turn, revealed its truths. This phenomenon was not confined to the jungles of the Amazon. In the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean and the coasts of Florida, another cartographic dream drove men to ruin and discovery in equal measure: the fountain of youth. This enduring legend, which some maps placed specifically on the island of Bimini, promised not wealth, but something even more precious: eternal vitality. It was this quest that famously propelled the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon on his voyages in the early 1500s. While he certainly never found a magical spring, his search led him to become the first European to formally explore the coastline of Florida, claiming it for Spain and irrevocably altering the geopolitical landscape of North America. His journey, motivated by a complete fiction, nonetheless added a crucial, real piece to the jigsaw puzzle of the American continent. The map's beautiful lie launched the ship that uncovered a plain truth. Yet no example is more iconic or more consequential than the miscalculation that guided Christopher Columbus. His famous journey in 1492 was built upon a foundation of selective reading and cartographic error. He was deeply influenced by the work of the French Cardinal Pierre Dailly, whose writings drew on Ptolemy's underestimated circumference of the Earth and Marco Polo's overestimated eastward reach of Asia. Columbus, combining these flawed sources with his own fervent ambition, produced a map and a calculation that was spectacularly wrong. He believed Japan lay only about 2,500 miles west of the Canary Islands, a journey he thought his ships could easily manage. The actual distance is more than 10,000 miles. Had he known the true vastness of the Atlantic, he might never have set sail. His courage was, in a very real sense, a product of his ignorance, an ignorance carefully curated and supported by the best maps and books available to him. The maps didn't just guide him, they deluded him into making history. This paradox forces us to reconsider what we mean by a wrong map. If a map's ultimate purpose is to inspire action that leads to greater understanding, then these inaccurate charts were profoundly functional. They were not in points of knowledge but starting pistols for inquiry. They provided the necessary fiction, the what if, that propelled societies out of their comfortable certainties and into the dangerous, rewarding unknown. A perfectly blank space on a map might have been more accurate, but it would have been inert. It would have suggested there was nothing to find. A space filled with a golden city or a restorative fountain, however, was a challenge. It was a dare. It whispered to kings and adventurers that glory, wealth, and immortality were just over the horizon, waiting for someone brave enough to go and claim them. The inaccuracy was the catalyst. This relationship between error and progress is not a relic of the age of sail. It is a fundamental pattern of human innovation. We see it in the scientific theories that are later proven wrong but which still manage to ask the right question, pushing research in a new direction. We see it in the startup that fails spectacularly but whose attempt reveals a completely new market or technology. In any field, a perfect, complete map of the territory is the final product of exploration, not its prerequisite. The journey always begins with a sketch, a hypothesis, a business plan, a rough draft that is full of guesses, hopes, and outright mistakes. The medieval mapmakers, in their glorious, beautiful inaccuracies, understood this intuitively. They knew that a map was not just a record of what was already known. It was a script for a story that had yet to be told, a set of instructions for the next adventurer who dared to believe that the blank spaces on their map were not voids to be feared, but invitations to begin. This urge to populate emptiness with meaning is one of the most fundamental and enduring human instincts, a psychological process we now understand as projection. The medieval mapmaker, facing a void of genuine information, did not simply leave it blank. He poured the entire contents of his own mind into that space. His deepest fears of shipwreck and drowning became the coiled sea serpents lurking just beyond the known shipping lanes. His profound hope for divine grace and a world beyond suffering became the meticulously illustrated earthly paradise, placed just out of reach at the map's eastern edge. His anxiety about foreign cultures and unseen lands became the monstrous races, the dog-headed cynocephali and the shadow-footed cyopods, who stood as guardians at the very boundaries of his understanding. These weren't random fantasies, they were a direct externalization of his inner world, a cartography of the soul as much as a chart of the earth. We engage in this exact same process today, though our tools have changed from parchment and quill to algorithms and data visualizations. Consider the modern financial chart. A line graph tracking the stock market is, in its raw form, just a collection of data points, but we cannot help but project onto it. We see patterns and faces in the random noise. We imbue a rising line with a sense of hope and a falling one with a sense of dread. And we fill the uncertain future at the right edge of the graph with our own assumptions about growth or collapse. We are mapping our anxieties about stability and our hopes for prosperity onto a blank financial space, just as the medieval cartographer mapped his spiritual hopes onto a physical one. Our social media feeds function as another kind of modern-day Mapa Mundi, where we carefully curate and project an idealized version of our lives, a personal paradise of success and happiness, while often viewing the curated projections of others as a terrifying landscape of comparison and inadequacy, a digital terra incognita filled with modern monsters of envy and isolation. This act of projection is not inherently bad. It is a fundamental part of how we make sense of a complex and often overwhelming world. Our brains are hardwired to be pattern recognition machines, and when we lack complete data, we automatically fill the gaps with our existing beliefs, experiences, and emotional states. The medieval mapmakers' projection provided a crucial sense of comfort and control. By transforming a vast, terrifying, and unknown ocean into a space populated by specific, named monsters, he made it knowable. It was less frightening to face a dragon you could draw and describe than to face the sheer, formless terror of the complete unknown. His map was a coping mechanism, a way to build a mental fence against the abyss. The danger, however, lies in the subtle shift from using these projections as personal placeholders to accepting them as objective reality. When the mapmaker's projection of foreign peoples as monstrous savages was copied onto chart after chart, it ceased to be one man's fear and became an accepted fact of the world, a truth that justified centuries of prejudice, exploitation, and violence. The map no longer reflected the world. It began to dictate how the world should be seen and interacted with, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where explorers arrived in new lands expecting to find monsters, and through the lens of their own bias often did. This is the powerful and urgent lesson these ancient maps hold up for us. They are a mirror reflecting our own perpetual struggle to separate what is truly out there from what we desperately fear or hope is there. They challenge us to perform a simple but profound act of self-awareness, to look at the maps we use to navigate our own lives, our mental models of success, our charts of social hierarchy, our internal landscapes of risk and reward, and to ask a critical question. Where are the dragons on my map? What monsters have I drawn into the blank spaces of my understanding based on nothing more than my own fear? What paradises have I imagined out of a deep yearning for escape? By recognizing the projections we layer onto our own realities, we take the first step towards scraping them away, not to leave an empty void, but to make space for a clearer, more honest, and ultimately more accurate view of the world as it truly is. Yet for all the grand cosmological diagrams and the state-sponsored sea charts, the story of medieval mapmaking has long been told as a singularly male pursuit, a narrative of monks in cloisters and merchants in port cities. But if we listen carefully, we can hear other voices in the chorus, voices that have been hushed by the centuries but never entirely silenced. The role of women in medieval cartography is a story not of center stage, but of profound influence from the margins through patronage, through scholarship, and through a unique form of creation that wove geography into the very fabric of spiritual life. In an era when formal education and guild membership were almost exclusively male privileges, one of the most powerful avenues for female influence was that of the patron. Wealthy noblewomen, often highly educated themselves, acted as crucial financial and intellectual sponsors for the creation of luxurious manuscripts, including maps. A figure like Marie de France, a 12th century noblewoman living in England, exemplifies this role. While best known for her poetry, her position in a courtly environment made her a likely commissioner or recipient of illuminated works that would have included Mundi and other cosmological diagrams. These objects were not mere decorations, they were instruments of education and status, used to instruct their children and to display their families' erudition and piety. By commissioning such works, these women were making a deliberate choice about what knowledge was valuable and ensuring its preservation and dissemination within their circles. Their patronage provided the economic fuel that allowed the artistic and scholarly engine of mapmaking to turn, directing the course of cartography from behind the scenes. Within the walls of convents, another group of women found a different, more direct path to engagement with geography: the creation of illuminated manuscripts. Numeries were not simply places of retreat. They were vibrant centers of learning and artistic production for aristocratic women. Here, nuns with the requisite skills in reading, Latin, and more importantly, the intricate art of illumination, worked as scribes and artists. Their output often included psalters, prayer books, and theological texts, and it was within these sacred pages that geographic knowledge was often encoded. A nun might meticulously illustrate a diagram of the winds blowing from the corners of the earth to accompany a biblical text, or she might paint a schematic of the zodiac man, an astrological map of the human body showing the influence of the stars. These were not world maps in the grand tradition of the Herford Mapa Mundi, but they were nonetheless acts of cartography, attempts to visually order and explain the relationship between the human, the terrestrial, and the divine. Their contributions, often anonymous, are woven into the very parchment of countless medieval manuscripts, a subtle but significant thread in the tapestry of geographic thought. The most spectacular exception to this narrative of anonymous contribution is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, mystic, and polymath who could arguably be called the most accomplished female intellectual of the entire Middle Ages. Though she never drew a traditional world map, Hildegard created what can only be described as profound symbolic maps of the cosmos within her visionary theological works. In texts like Civias and Liber Divinorum Operum, she described and likely directed the illustration of breathtakingly complex cosmological visions. One of the most famous is her image of the universe as a cosmic egg, with layers of flaming fire, dark air, and pure ether surrounding the Earth at its center. In another, she maps the intricate and symbiotic relationship between the human soul, the human body, and the natural world, showing how the winds correspond to human passions and the elements to bodily humors. This was cartography of the highest order, but of a spiritual and allegorical kind. She was mapping the architecture of salvation itself, charting a course not from London to Jerusalem, but from sin to redemption, from earthly existence to heavenly union. Her work expands our very definition of what a map can be, reminding us that the most important journeys are often interior ones. The involvement of women, therefore, added a distinct and vital dimension to medieval geographic understanding. While male clerics might have been preoccupied with placing Jerusalem at the center of a flat earth, and merchant cartographers were charting precise coastlines, the contributions of women like Hildegard and the anonymous nuns in scriptoriums often emphasized the allegorical and the interconnected. Their maps and diagrams were less concerned with measuring physical distance and more focused on illustrating spiritual proximity, moral alignment, and the hidden harmonies between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the human soul. This was a perspective born from their unique position, often excluded from the formal institutions of geographic learning, but deeply immersed in a holistic, monastic worldview that saw all creation as a single, divinely authored text to be decoded. Acknowledging these contributions does more than just add a few new names to the historical record. It fundamentally challenges and enriches the entire narrative of medieval mapmaking. It forces us to move beyond the image of the solitary monk bent over a parchment and to see instead a collaborative, multifaceted intellectual endeavor happening in courts, monasteries, and convents across Europe. It reveals that the drive to map and understand the world was not confined to one gender, but was a shared human impulse that found expression wherever curiosity and the means to create intersected. The story of medieval cartography is not a simple one of progress from superstition to science, but a complex symphony of voices, some shouting from the crow's nest of a ship, some chanting in a cathedral, some whispering in a quiet scriptorium, all trying to sing the world into being. To hear only the loudest voices is to miss the harmony of the whole. But the world these mapmakers were trying to capture wasn't just in their minds or their books. It was physically manifested on a very specific and demanding canvas. To truly appreciate their craft, we have to step into their workshop and understand the profound relationship between their vision and the very materials that made it possible. The parchment, the inks, the pigments, these weren't just passive supplies. They were active collaborators in the creative process, imposing their own limits and possibilities on every line drawn and every color laid down. The choice of medium wasn't arbitrary. It was a series of calculated decisions that directly influenced the map's cost, its durability, its intended audience, and ultimately, the very geographical knowledge it was meant to preserve. The foundation of nearly every prestigious medieval map was parchment or vellum, terms often used interchangeably, though vellum typically came from higher quality calfskin. Creating this writing surface was a messy, labor-intensive, and frankly, smelly business. It began with the skin of a goat, sheep, or calf, which was first soaked in a lime solution to loosen hair and fat. It was then stretched taut on a frame and meticulously scraped thin with a lunellum, a crescent-shaped knife, a process requiring immense skill to achieve a uniform thickness without tearing the delicate skin. The finished product was a smooth, resilient, and incredibly durable surface, far superior to the paper that was beginning to trickle into Europe from the Islamic world. Parchment's unique qualities directly shaped the mapmaker's art. Its slight translucency allowed for tracing and copying, a crucial feature in an age before photocopiers. Its toughness could withstand repeated erasures with a pumice stone, letting the cartographer correct mistakes, but it was also maddeningly temperamental. It was highly sensitive to changes in humidity, prone to cockling and warping, which could distort the very geography it was meant to display, and its expense was staggering. A large world map like the Hereford Mapa Mundi, measuring over 5 feet across, required the skins of an entire herd of animals, stitched together by a master parchmenter. This incredible cost meant that mapmaking was never a casual pursuit. It was a serious investment, usually funded by the church or a wealthy patron, and this financial backing inevitably shaped the content, ensuring it aligned with the theological or political views of its backer. Once the parchment was prepared, the mapmaker turned to his palette, each color a story in itself. The most common ink for drawing the precise lines of coastlines and writing the thousands of place names was iron gall ink, a powerful and permanent concoction made from oak gallnuts, iron sulfate, gum arabic, and water. This ink started life as a pale, yellowish brown but oxidized on the parchment to a deep, enduring black, perfect for the fine, legible script required. But for the color that brought the map to life, the Illuminator reached for his pots of pigment. These were not simple dyes. They were minerals and earths ground painstakingly by hand into a fine powder, and then mixed with a binding agent like egg white or gum to create paint. Verdigris, a striking blue-green, was made by exposing copper to vinegar fumes. Red came from either cinnabar, a toxic mercury mineral, or from lead red. A rich, velvety black could be made from crushed charcoal or lampblack, but the most coveted color of all was ultramarine blue, derived from the precious lapis lazuli stone, which could only be found in a single remote region of Afghanistan. Its import cost was astronomical, often exceeding the price of gold itself. Its use was therefore reserved for the most sacred of elements, the robe of the Virgin Mary, the walls of the heavenly Jerusalem, instantly communicating divine importance through its breathtaking, costly brilliance. And then there was gold, the ultimate symbol of celestial light and supreme value. Applying gold leaf was the final, most delicate step, performed by the most skilled artisan. The chosen area was first painted with a sticky base called gesso, a mix of gypsum and glue. Once this was tacky, the Illuminator would carefully lay down a wafer-thin sheet of genuine gold leaf, which would then be burnished with a smooth stone or even a wolf's tooth until it shone with a warm, radiant light. This wasn't mere decoration, it was cartographic theology. The application of gold to a city like Jerusalem or a representation of Christ literally made it shine, drawing the viewer's eye and soul toward the holiest parts of the creation. The material itself was communicating a hierarchy of sanctity, a visual language that anyone, literate or not, could instantly understand. The map didn't just tell you where things were. Through its materials, it told you what was important. This intimate, physical relationship between maker and material created maps that were not just informational but deeply sensual objects. To view a medieval map was to engage all the senses. You would hear the crackle of the parchment as you unrolled it, see the light catch the burnished gold, and almost feel the subtle texture of the painted surfaces under your fingertips. They had a tangible presence, a weight and a smell that commanded reverence. This stands in the starkest contrast to our modern experience of cartography. Our digital maps on phones and screens are ethereal, dynamic, and instantly updatable. They possess the magic of interactivity and real-time data, but they lack the soul of a singular, handcrafted artifact. A GPS map is a utility. A medieval Mapa Mundi was a treasure. The constraints of parchment and pigment forced a permanence and intentionality that our fluid digital world has largely abandoned. Every mark on that animal skin was final, a commitment. There was no undo button, no copy-paste function. This limitation bred an incredible depth of thought and planning before a single line was drawn. The material reality of the craft meant that maps were designed not for constant revision, but for lasting impact to be pondered over for generations, each one a unique and irreplaceable window into the mind of its maker and the world they believed they knew. Yet for all their spiritual symbolism and artistic grandeur, these magnificent maps possessed another, far more worldly power. They were not merely objects of contemplation. In the hands of kings and popes, they became precision instruments of diplomacy, wielded in the high-stakes game of medieval statecraft. Imagine the scene in a drafty royal court. An ambassador from a rival kingdom unrolls a vast, beautifully illuminated map, a gift from his master. The courtiers gasp at its beauty, but the king's eyes narrow, scanning the carefully drawn borders. Does the map show his lands diminished, squeezed by the territory of his neighbor? Does it generously include a disputed duchy within his rival's domain, a silent claim made in ink and gold leaf? In an age without satellites or standardized treaties, a map was a powerful argument, a visual proposition that could justify an alliance, provoke a war, or legitimize a claim to a throne. This was cartography as a form of soft power long before the term was coined, a way to project influence, wealth, and knowledge without ever drawing a sword. The creation of a map like the magnificent Catalan Atlas was an act of geopolitical theater, commissioned around 1375 by the rulers of Aragon for presentation to the young Charles VI of France. It was far more than a scholarly work. It was a calculated display of Catalan commercial and maritime supremacy. The atlas meticulously charts the trade routes of the Mediterranean and down the West African coast, routes dominated by Catalan sailors and merchants. By presenting this document to the French king, the Aragonese crown was sending a clear, multifaceted message. On one level, it was a gesture of flattery and alliance, showcasing shared Christian knowledge against the wider world of Muslims and Mongols. But on a deeper, more assertive level, it was a boast. It said, "Look at the extent of our knowledge and our reach. We know these worlds, we trade with these kings, we navigate these seas. Our power is not just military, it is economic and intellectual." The map itself became a vessel of national prestige, its very existence proof that the kingdom that could produce such a thing was a force to be reckoned with, a worthy ally and a dangerous foe. This practice of cartographic persuasion extended far beyond grand gifts between monarchs. Maps were routinely used to settle or inflame territorial disputes between lesser lords, dukes, and bishops. A monastery might commission a map showing the generous boundaries of its land grants from a long-dead emperor, a visual document to be presented in a legal dispute with a neighboring baron who was encroaching on its fields. The map's authority derived from its beauty, its apparent objectivity, and its likely blessing by the church, lent immense weight to the claim. Conversely, a powerful noble might have a map drawn that conveniently omitted a rival's castle or showed a river, a common natural border flowing in a slightly different course that favored his own claims. In a largely illiterate society, the visual argument of a map could be far more persuasive than a complex legal text. It presented a fact on the ground made of parchment, a reality that, if drawn confidently enough, could become accepted truth. This historical reality shatters any illusion that maps were ever neutral documents. They were, from their very inception, deeply ideological. The choice of what to include was as political as the choice of what to omit. A map meant for a Christian audience might deliberately exaggerate the size and importance of the Holy Land, while shrinking the vast and powerful domains of the Islamic world. A map created for a trading consortium would lavishly detail the ports and markets they wished to dominate, while leaving the interior of continents, the domains of potential competitors, strangely blank or filled with decorative patterns. The mapmaker was never a free agent. He was an employee working to a brief set by his patron. His task was to use his skill not to reveal the world as it was, but to portray the world as his patron wanted it to be seen, a tool for building consensus and manufacturing legitimacy for a particular worldview. This medieval understanding of maps as tools of power finds a direct and chilling parallel in our own time. The bitter disputes over borders in the South China Sea are not just fought with ships and planes, but with maps. Competing nations publish official maps with 9 dash lines or other demarcations that extend their claimed territorial waters hundreds of miles, using cartography to assert sovereignty over crucial shipping lanes and underwater resources. Similarly, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is, in many ways, a conflict over maps over which roads, settlements, and borders are drawn on official documents, determining access, ownership, and the very right to exist for millions of people. Modern technology has only amplified this power. Digital maps and geographic information systems can be used to redraw districts in partisan gerrymandering, effectively choosing voters instead of voters choosing representatives. The algorithms that decide what appears on your screen when you search for a location can make certain communities visible or invisible, shaping economic opportunity and public perception with a few lines of code. The parchment and ink have been replaced by pixels and data, but the game remains exactly the same. He who controls the map controls the narrative, and he who controls the narrative controls the world. For the medieval mind, the Earth was not a lonely planet spinning in the void. It was the vibrant, living heart of a vast and intricately designed cosmic engine. To draw a map of the world was therefore an incomplete task if it did not also account for the celestial machinery that governed it. This is why the most ambitious medieval maps are not just charts of land and sea, but breathtaking cosmographies. They present a complete picture of existence, from the damp soil underfoot to the empyrean heavens above, all woven together into a single, divine system where the movements of the stars directly choreographed the rhythms of life on Earth. This was a universe of profound interconnection, and the mapmaker was its chief illustrator, tasked with showing humanity its precise and purposeful place within the grand celestial hierarchy. This cosmic perspective is vividly illustrated by the common practice of encircling world maps with the 12 signs of the zodiac. This was not a whimsical decorative border, it was a functional astrological clock face. Each zodiac sign was meticulously aligned with a specific region of the world, believed to exert its unique influence over the climate, the character of the people, and even the types of animals found there. The fiery sign of Leo might be shown governing the sun-scorched deserts of Africa, infusing its inhabitants with a bold and passionate nature. The watery sign of Pisces could be linked to the stormy North Atlantic, influencing the tempestuous seas and the hardy fishermen who braved them. This system provided a powerful, pseudo-scientific explanation for the world's diversity. It wasn't random that different places had different weather, crops, and cultures. It was all dictated by the cosmic forces emanating from the stars and planets passing through these celestial gateways. The map became a predictive almanac, allowing a scholar to theoretically understand the fate of a kingdom or the success of a harvest by studying the astrological conditions hanging over it. Beyond this zodiacal belt, many maps, particularly those found in scholarly texts, incorporated intricate cosmological diagrams. The most influential model was the Ptolemaic system, which depicted the universe as a series of concentric, transparent spheres nesting around the Earth like a celestial onion. The innermost spheres contained the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond them lay the sphere of the fixed stars, the backdrop of the zodiac, and finally the primum mobile, the first mover that set the entire universe in motion. Encasing it all was the empyrean heaven, the boundless, immaterial realm of God and the angels. Mapmakers would often depict this entire structure in the margins of a world map or in a separate diagram, showing the Earth with its familiar continents as the fixed center of this glorious, spinning celestial mechanism. You were not just looking at a map of countries, you were looking at your address within the entire cosmos, a tiny but crucial part of an immense and ordered whole. This holistic vision served a profound psychological purpose in an era defined by uncertainty. Plague, famine, and war could strike without any apparent reason, creating a world that felt chaotic and terrifying. But the astrological map offered a powerful antidote to this anxiety. It proposed that nothing was truly random. A bad harvest wasn't just misfortune. It was the result of Mars influencing a particular region, an event that could potentially be predicted and understood. This belief in a regulated universe, however intimidating its forces might be, provided a crucial sense of order and predictability. It replaced blind terror with a knowable, if complex, system of cause and effect that connected human fate directly to the majestic, turning gears of the heavens. The map was a promise that the universe operated under rules, and by understanding those rules through both scripture and the stars, one could find a measure of comfort and control. This medieval drive to connect the microcosm of human experience with the macrocosm of the universe is a thread that runs unbroken through human history, though our language for it has changed. Today, we have largely abandoned the geocentric model and the influence of zodiac signs, but the fundamental desire to find our place in a vast, interconnected system is more potent than ever. We see it in the frontiers of modern physics, where theories like quantum entanglement suggest a universe where particles millions of light-years apart can instantaneously affect each other, echoing the ancient belief in invisible, instantaneous connections between the celestial and the terrestrial. We see it in ecology, which teaches us that the flutter of a butterfly's wings can theoretically influence weather patterns across a continent, a concept that would have felt perfectly logical to a medieval cartographer who believed a star's alignment could dictate the fate of a harvest. Our tools have changed from astrolabes to particle accelerators, and our models from nested spheres to multiverses, but the quest remains identical: to draw the ultimate map that shows how we, small as we are woven into the magnificent and mysterious fabric of everything that exists. Yet for all their power in their own time, the fate of most medieval maps was a quiet disappearance. Parchment is a fragile medium, vulnerable to fire, flood, rot, and the simple neglect of generations that no longer understood their value. Countless masterpieces of cartographic imagination were doubtless lost, repurposed as book bindings, used to stiffen the lining of a chest, or simply crumbling to dust in some forgotten abbey cellar. They were, for a time, obsolete artifacts of a surpassed worldview, their intricate symbolism as foreign as a dead language. But the ones that survived through sheer luck and circumstance have been granted a remarkable and unexpected second life, a vibrant afterlife that their creators could never have imagined. These maps have undergone a profound transformation, from functional objects to revered icons, and their journey from the scriptorium to the museum tells its own fascinating story about how we choose to value the past. The star of this survival story is undoubtedly the Herford Mapa Mundi. Its very existence today feels like a minor miracle. For centuries, it hung ignored in a dark choir of Hereford Cathedral, a curious but largely incomprehensible relic. It wasn't until the 19th century that scholars began to truly appreciate what they had, recognizing it not as a failed attempt at geography, but as a master key to the medieval mind. This shift in perception sparked a new mission, not to correct the map but to preserve it. This has become a never-ending, high-stakes endeavor. The map now resides in a custom-built, climate-controlled case, a sarcophagus of glass and technology designed to protect it from its oldest enemies, fluctuating humidity, light, and the passage of time itself. Every glance we steal at it today is a victory against entropy, made possible by a small army of conservators, chemists, and historians who treat its preservation with the gravity of a holy covenant. This intense care is a testament to its value, but it also fundamentally changes our relationship with it. We can no longer unroll it casually on a table. We must approach it with reverence, viewing it from a respectful distance, a treasured patient in a permanent intensive care unit. Thankfully, the digital age has offered a powerful solution to this paradox of preservation versus access. High-resolution digitization projects have performed a kind of magic on these artifacts. We can now explore the Herford Mapa Mundi online, zooming into microscopic levels of detail that would be impossible with the naked eye, studying the anxious frown on a dog-headed man or the individual brushstrokes that make up a sea monster's scale, all without exposing the fragile original to a single photon of harmful light. This digital resurrection has democratized access, placing these once secret documents on the laptops of schoolchildren and the smartphones of curious viewers around the globe. The maps have been set free from their glass cases, their pixels traveling at the speed of light to reach an audience wider than their creators ever dreamed of. They have become, in a very real sense, immortal. This new accessibility has fueled a renaissance in how we interpret them. They are no longer just the domain of historians tracing coastlines. Now, art historians deconstruct their symbolic language and artistic techniques, analyzing the sourcing of their pigments to trace medieval trade routes. Psychologists study them as profound examples of how humans use projection and narrative to cope with the terror of the unknown, drawing direct lines from medieval dragons to our own modern anxieties about everything from pandemics to artificial intelligence. Literary scholars mine them for the myths and legends that informed entire cultures. The map has been fractured into 1,000 different lenses, each revealing a new facet of the world that made it. It is no longer a single document but a sprawling interdisciplinary playground, a single object that can launch 1,000 theses. Perhaps most surprisingly, these maps have escaped the academy entirely and leaped headfirst into popular culture. Their visual language, the swirling seas, the schematic cities, the lurking beasts on the edge of the known, has become a shorthand for fantasy, adventure, and mystery. You can find their aesthetic echoed in the opening credits of fantasy films, on the covers of role-playing game manuals, and in the concept art for video games that invite players to explore vast, unmapped worlds. The phrase, "Here be dragons," has been stripped of its original Latin and transformed into a ubiquitous cultural meme, used to mark everything from the dangerous corners of a spreadsheet to the unexplored potential of a new relationship. These maps have become a universal symbol for the thrill of discovery itself, their inaccuracies now part of their charm, a reminder that the journey is often more compelling than the destination. In this vibrant afterlife, these maps have achieved something their creators never intended. They have become mirrors for ourselves. We no longer look through them to see the world as it was, but at them to understand how we see the world today. They hold up a distorted glass to our own modern certainty, asking us uncomfortable questions about our own digital maps. What invisible monsters lurk in the algorithms of our navigation apps? What modern-day Prester Johns are we chasing in the form of utopian technologies or political saviors? What blank spaces are we still terrified to admit we don't understand, filling them instead with our own projections and prejudices? A medieval map in all its glorious wrongness is the perfect antidote to arrogance. It is a humbling reminder that every generation believes its own map to be the final and definitive version, only to be proven hopelessly quaint by the next. They teach us that a map is never just a record of a place, but a record of a mind, a time, and a desperate, beautiful, and profoundly human attempt to shine a little light into the overwhelming darkness. So as we lower the magnifying glass on these incredible documents, we're left not with a simple conclusion, but with a profound invitation to reconsider our own place in the world. The minds of those medieval mapmakers were indeed vast landscapes, but not of a foreign country. They were human landscapes built from the same fundamental drives that shape us today: the need to belong, the thirst for understanding, and the courage to face the darkness with nothing but a story and a steady hand. Their quills were not just drawing coastlines, they were sketching the very boundaries of human courage in an age of profound mystery, and their conviction was the compass that guided them through a world where faith and fact were not yet strangers, but intimate partners in the greatest quest of all, the quest to find meaning. Their maps, for all their wild inaccuracies, were never failures. To call them inaccurate is to miss the point entirely. They were triumphs of a different kind of truth. They were accurate representations of the human spirit at a specific moment in time, capturing a breathtaking collision of hope, fear, and wonder. They stand as monumental expressions of a curiosity so powerful it could populate entire continents with the contents of its own dreams. This legacy is far more valuable than a perfectly measured coastline. It is a reminder that every map we create, from a scribbled grocery list to the most complex digital simulation of dark matter, is first and foremost a story. It is a narrative shaped by the worldview, the biases, the tools, and the deepest yearnings of its creator. The Herford Mapa Mundi tells us less about the actual shape of Africa and more about the breathtaking ambition of a civilization that believed it could capture the entire drama of creation, from the Garden of Eden to the Apocalypse, on a single sheet of calfskin. As we navigate our own complex realities, saturated with data and drowning in information, these ancient cartographers offer us a strangely timely gift. They invite us to embrace a little of their creative bravery, to blend our modern, relentless inquiry with a touch of their imaginative audacity. They challenge us to remember that the most insightful maps we can ever make are not those that claim to have all the answers, but those that possess the wisdom to gracefully acknowledge the limits of what we can truly see and know. They teach us to leave a little room for wonder in the margins of our own certainty, to understand that the blank spaces on our charts are not errors to be eliminated, but possibilities to be pondered. In an age of absolute answers, they champion the beautiful, generative power of the question mark. Thank you for embarking on this journey into the deepest terra incognita of all, the human mind itself. These maps are more than history, they are a mirror. What dragons are you drawing on the edges of your own world? Share your thoughts and your own stories of navigating the unknown in the comments below, and be sure to explore our other episodes for more adventures into the heart of medieval history. The journey is far from over.